so that everyone knows the perspective that I come from. I am a teacher. I have actually been a teacher for the last 12 years. I started teaching, my first teaching job was in 2000, 12 years ago. I started teaching at the grade 5 level. I had a grade 5 homeroom, and I taught the main subjects, math, science, language arts, social studies, and I taught grade 5 for the first 7 years of my teaching career with a few other grades here and there, depending on how the year went. And then the last 5 years, I actually made a switch, and now I teach at the high school level. And so I now teach high school social studies, so history, geography, and all those kinds of subjects. I have my university training from the University of Manitoba. So I have my Bachelor of Education, my Post-Baccalaureate Certificate in Education, my Master's in Education. I list all of this off. I list my teaching experience and I list my degrees in education to counteract one of the first criticisms that I usually hear about people who say the things that I'm about to say this evening. And the statement usually is, you don't know what it's like in a regular classroom. There was one radio show that I was on a couple months ago, I think it was in British Columbia, and the host was interviewing me about some education issue, and I was talking about something to do with the curriculum. And for some reason, the host didn't mention I was a teacher. He mentioned my affiliation with the Frontier Center, but he didn't mention that I was a teacher. He took phone calls where people would call in and ask me questions. Sure enough, first phone call, this guy wouldn't last 5 minutes if he had to actually set foot in a regular classroom. And so I list all my teaching experience just to make it clear that I do know what it's like in the classroom. I do know what it's like to teach in the public system. My plan here this evening is to give you a better insight in terms of what's happening with public education. And frankly, education really is its own world. Up on the screen, you'll see that I put just a bit more information about myself for those who are interested. Obviously, the Frontier Center for Public Policy posts a lot of my columns and other writings and media interviews. I also have a personal website, michaelzwaagstra.com, and the book that I co-authored was published a couple years ago. It's called What's Wrong with Our Schools, and I do have copies here with me this evening for those who are interested. So I want to start out by laying a little bit of groundwork, and one of the first things that we need to do is to do a little bit of philosophy. Now, I'm going to keep this part brief because I know how much everyone loves educational philosophy, but I think it's important that we set forth the ground rules in terms of the assumptions and how we look at things. What I have up here is what's called the traditional education philosophy. Traditional may not be the best word because it conjures up all types of images that may not necessarily be accurate, but it's really probably the best term out there in terms of describing the perspective that I come from. My belief is this: schools must ensure that students are knowledgeable and skillful in specific subject content areas and are educated to be successful in a complex modern society. So there's some things that naturally flow out of this, and some of the things that naturally flow out include, that we have to have clear curriculum content. We need to specifically identify what it is kids need to learn. There needs to be regular homework. You can't master something if you never practice it, and so of course there's going to be homework for those who believe in this philosophy. You need consistent discipline. The teacher needs to be charged of the classroom, not the students. It needs to be the teacher, and the teacher has to enforce the school rules. And knowledgeable teachers. Teachers actually have to know their subject. They need to know what they're explaining to their students. So this approach, the traditional approach to education, I believe has widespread support across Canadian society. But it's actually not the dominant philosophy in our schools today. What I'm advocating with this approach is actually hotly contested in educational circles, because the other philosophy I dub romantic progressivism. You can also call it constructivism. It goes by a number of different terms. And in this philosophical approach, it's quite different. Teachers help students use their own interest and knowledge base to construct an understanding of the world around them. So instead of identifying specific things everyone needs to learn and making sure everyone masters it, this totally reverses it. Rather, this is about students constructing their own understanding, their own knowledge. We don't want to dictate what it is we want everyone to actually know. So what logically comes out of this? Well, you tend to get some pretty fuzzy curricular outcomes, and I'm going to be giving some examples of that this evening. You have a focus on process, an emphasis on the so-called process or what's happening with the learning rather than what you're actually learning. Subject matter expertise is less important. People who subscribe to this philosophy downplay the importance of subject matter knowledge. This is the dominant educational philosophy in our schools today, not the first one that I just put up. Now, one thing I want to make clear as well from the outside is that these issues transcend political boundaries or partisan boundaries, however we want to look at it. This is not about left versus right. This is not about Sask Party or NDP or Conservative. This is simply about what is good education policy. E.D. Hirsch is a well-known education reformer in the United States. He's also a professor of English at the University of Virginia, and I think he summed it up very well when describing his educational philosophy. He states the following in his book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. He says, "I would label myself a political liberal and an educational conservative, or perhaps more accurately, an educational pragmatist. Political liberals really ought to oppose progressive educational ideas because they have led to practical failure and greater social inequality. The only practical way to achieve liberalism's aim of greater social justice is to pursue conservative educational policies." And I would substitute the word traditional for conservative in this case. And so what Hirsch is saying is that if you truly are wanting to advocate for the downtrodden, the people in society that have the least, you'd better be a strong advocate of clear curriculum, good standards, knowledgeable teachers, because that's what's going to give people the ability to get out of poverty. So again, just putting that groundwork in place, that this is not about left versus right. And there certainly are some problems in public education. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to identify some of the key problems that I think there are in public education, and then I will identify what I believe some solutions are, so to try to have some positive toward the end. The first major problem in public education today, and the one that I'm going to focus on the most, is what I call an anti-knowledge curriculum approach. An anti-knowledge curriculum approach. Now, that's a pretty harsh statement, to call schools largely anti-knowledge. But I'm going to back that up here. Some of you might have heard this saying, "Teachers teach students, not subjects." Most people here, if you've been to an education faculty, you've heard this phrase. If you're a teacher and you've gone to an in-service, you've heard this phrase. Basically, what that phrase means, and I've heard it more times than I can count, the phrase epitomizes the current lack of focus on actual subject matter. It's a way of de-emphasizing the importance of content. So, so as teachers supposed to say, I teach students, I don't teach subjects. You think about that, how much sense does that type of phrase actually make? If I were to meet a driving instructor and I, asked him what did he teach, and he said, well, I don't teach driving, I teach students. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yeah, he teaches driving to students, just like I'm a teacher who teaches subjects to students. It's like a pilot saying, I don't fly planes, I fly passengers. Well, yeah, okay, you're passenger-oriented and all that, but yes, you do fly planes. And so, yes, teachers teach subjects. Absolutely. But in many school divisions, when you're getting your professional development in services, you're hearing the exact opposite. The learning is all about process rather than actual standards. And I'm going to get into a couple of specific examples here. One of the examples that I want to get into is that of mathematics. Last year, the Frontier Center for Public Policy released a policy paper of mine called Math Instruction That Makes Sense. Some of you might have kids in the public system, and you might have seen a textbook called Math Makes Sense, or you might have seen one called Math Focus. I can assure you that if you actually try to go through those textbooks and understand them, it doesn't make any sense. But what I did in this policy paper was take a look at the new curriculum. And Saskatchewan has the new curriculum, Manitoba has it, Alberta is implementing it, and what the new curriculum does is that nowhere in it, and you can search high and low in the curriculum guides, you do not find any requirement for students to memorize times tables. It's not in there. Yes, I know that many teachers will still choose to do that, but it's not actually required in the curriculum. There's nowhere in the curriculum does it say that a student should know their times tables by memory up to 10 times 10. Not in there. It's also not in there that students need to learn standard algorithms. And by algorithms, I simply mean, your basic, your standard ways of adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. The standard ways that most people learned when they were younger that are efficient and work effectively. Those things aren't in the curriculum guides either. And for the most part, they're not in the textbooks. Take a look at this example here. I picked a simple number. Now, I realize a lot of people here could do 23 times 11 in their head, but just bear with me in terms of and assume that we actually have to work this out. So simple 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication question. This is the type of thing that's commonly taught at about the grade 5 level. I remember teaching this when I was teaching grade 5. This is what we call the traditional algorithm. You know, you put one number on top of the other number, and then you multiply digit by digit. So you multiply the 1 times the 3, put the 3 there, the 1 times the 2, put the 2 there, and then you go down a bit, and then you put the 0 to hold the 10 spot, and then you multiply 1 times 3, 1 times 2, you put that number underneath, and you add it up. Now, this is a really easy question here, but the beauty about this traditional algorithm is it works with bigger numbers too. You can do 3-digit by 3-digit very efficiently with this algorithm. You can do 4-digit by 4-digit, and so on. It works. Now, this is not the only way to solve multiplication questions, but can you imagine, not having a calculator and trying to do 2-digit multiplication without knowing this algorithm? Well, take a look at what happens with textbooks today. My example is from Math Focus 5. Now, this is the same question, 23 times 11 equals. Well, it encourages you to draw multiplication arrays, which are these little diagrams to indicate what's called the distributive property. And then you're supposed to round it down, so that way you simplify it, allegedly. So you go 20 times 10 equals 200, and 20 times 1 equals 20, 3 times 10, you do all that, and then you line them up like this, and then you write it out over here, and then you have 200 plus 20 plus 3 plus 30 plus 3, and then you get 253. Now, I realize this works. You can do this. You can make it work. But if you're a grade 5 student and you're just learning how to do this, is this the method that you want to be encouraging students to use? Now, if you're wondering, is this the only method used in the math textbooks? No, they use other equally confusing ones that do the same kind of stuff. And what you will not find in Math Focus or in Math Makes Sense, the other common math textbook, you will not find this. Not in there. You will find lots of this. So if the goal is actually to get students to learn how to do math and to solve equations and to solve problems, do you not want them to be able to do it the most efficient way possible? Because this is not in the curriculum. Now, thank goodness there are still many teachers who think it's a little silly that the curriculum doesn't require this and that the textbooks don't have it, so they show it anyway. That's what I did. It wasn't in the textbook I was supposed to use, but of course I showed them how to do this. But it's actually not required, and it's not what's encouraged in teacher professional development sessions. And this is a major problem. There's a reason why my report got so much attention across Saskatchewan. This is affecting parents. This is affecting parents' ability to make sure that their kids actually learn their math. Now, one of the individuals who's really influenced the curriculum, and our curriculum here in Western Canada is called the Western and Northern Curriculum Protocol. It's the template that the curriculum is based upon. One of the people that's most influential in the philosophy behind it is a professor of education from New York City by the name of Catherine Fosnot. She's a well-known writer on the topic of math education. Her ideas dominate math instruction today. She is very influential. Let's take a look at what she says about what she thinks is an example of good math instruction. This is from an article she wrote in a journal called The Constructivist. Learning, deep conceptual learning, is about structural shifts in cognition. It is about self-organizing at moments of criticality. These changes are complex and nonlinear, and they are the result of interacting autopoietic systems. From a constructivist perspective, meaning is understood to be the result of humans setting up relationships, reflecting on their actions, and modeling and constructing explanations. If you've never read Edubabble, there it is. Good luck trying to decipher that. I don't know if I should admit this, I'm actually familiar enough with this stuff that I think I actually know what she's saying. Well, I do know what she's saying. She's saying that the best type of math instruction is when kids figure it all out themselves, and then it's more authentic and such. That's really what she believes. She believes that kids should figure out algorithms and ways of solving math questions on their own. And that's really what's behind this philosophy. But then they dress it up in the Edubabble, so that way regular parents have no idea what they're actually saying. But her writings have been massively influential. If you go to the curriculum guides, look in the bibliography, you'll see a bunch of her writings right there. And there's others that are just like her. I just decided to pick her because she's one of the most prominent. Now, I'm not the only person that's been pointing out problems with the math curriculum, both here and across North America. About a year ago, I came across a very interesting article in Educational Leadership. And Educational Leadership is a pretty mainline education journal. And there was an article by W. Stephen Wilson. He's a math professor at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And he conducted a review of the math curricula across all 50 states in the U.S. Now, if you're thinking, wait a second, I'm quoting an American here, the Canadian math curricula and the American math curricula are very, very similar on many key points. And a lot of, in fact, if you look at teacher training, what's happening in education faculty here, look at who writes all the textbooks, it's all from the U.S. You know, we've got this idea that it's totally different here, and it's not. It's Americans who are generally writing our education philosophy for us. Anyway, this is what W. Stephen Wilson had to say after his review. The big picture I took away from this experience is the complete disconnect between elementary school math and college requirements. The majority of states fail to focus on the mathematics that elementary school children need to learn to be successful in college math. And that's arithmetic, understanding and fluency with the standard procedures for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It almost seemed like a plot to prevent children from leaving home for college, or at least to get them to come home quickly because of lack of preparedness. It's a pretty harsh statement, but he's saying that because that's what he found when he was looking at the math curriculum guides. Same thing here in Canada. There's a group of math professors, both at the University of Manitoba, University of Winnipeg, and right here at the University of Regina, have actually formed a group called WISE Math, the Western Initiative for Strengthening Education in Mathematics. I've actually provided a lot of advice to this group. I know the professors that are involved personally. I've spent time talking with them about their frustrations with the curriculum. One of these professors actually spent time on a curriculum committee in Manitoba, only to find out that the standards had essentially been removed without his being aware of it, because they just took it away and they used a bunch of edubabble, and he wasn't even aware of what was being taken away. But these professors are very frustrated. One of these professors, Anna Stockey, teaches at the University of Winnipeg, and she has a very interesting thing to say about those who claim that the new math is research-based and supported by the evidence. Here's what she had to say in the Winnipeg Free Press last year. I have spent a fair amount of time perusing math education articles and have observed that many of these new teaching methods are based on studies that fail to conform to proper statistical research study protocols, small sample sizes, lack of randomization, missing or improper control groups. I am therefore very dubious whenever I hear the term research shows in regards to math teaching methods. And I would encourage everyone here to be dubious as well. When someone makes the claim that this new math technique that doesn't involve the standard algorithms or memorizing anything is actually more effective, challenge them on them. Ask them, what is this actual research? I've looked at some of these research articles as well. A lot of them involve studies of 5 students or 6 students. It's incredible that some of these studies are used to justify this new approach to teaching math. Part of the problem, of course, is that most people aren't aware of these issues until their kids are actually in the system, and then, of course, they're so busy trying to help their kids, they don't have time to actually pursue constructive change here. Now, math is not the only subject that's impacted by this anti-knowledge approach. English language arts, or ELA for short, is much the same thing has happened there. If you ever take a look at an English language arts curriculum guide, they're very long and very detailed, and filled with nothing of substance. Like there really is nothing there. Let me give you an example. This is from the Saskatchewan ELA curriculum. Now, what I did is I actually picked one of the best parts of the curriculum in terms of identifying something specific that kids should actually be able to do. The first one here is from the grade 5 level. Students should read and demonstrate comprehension of a range of contemporary and classical grade-appropriate fiction, script, poetry, and nonfiction, including magazines, reports, instructions, and procedures from various cultures, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and countries, including Canada. Now, if you just sort of glance at this, you think, wow, kids are going to learn a wide variety of things. That sounds really good. But you'll notice what's missing, and what's missing in the rest of the curriculum guide is nowhere in the curriculum guide does it say, here's actually the specific books. Here's some of the specific books everyone should have been exposed to at some point. Not there. I know there's a suggested reading guide that teachers can use if they want, and some schools will choose to implement more specifics. But if you look at just the curriculum itself, there's actually nothing specified. Now look at the next one right below it. This is from the grade 11 curriculum. You might notice it's kind of similar to the grade 5 standard. Read and demonstrate comprehension and appreciation of grade-appropriate informational, including instructions in procedural texts, and literary, including fiction, nonfiction, script, poetry, and essays, First Nations, Métis, Saskatchewan, Canadian, and international texts. You'll notice it says almost exactly the same thing, word for word, as what it says at the grade 5 level. Why can they do that? Because it's an empty shell. It doesn't actually have anything in here. Let me prove that to you. In either of these curriculum standards, is there a requirement to read an entire full-length book? No. You have to do selections from books, and you could choose to use a full book, but it doesn't say you have to read a whole book. In other sections where it talks about writing, does it say you have to write a full, complete essay? No, it's actually not specifically required. I know teachers can choose to add that in, but it's actually nowhere specified in the curriculum that you have to read any specific books or a book at all. You could read excerpts of whatever the teacher happens to choose. I mean, this is so broad, you could do just about anything within it. And this is why when I talk to teachers who teach ELA, and I've taught ELA myself, common statement that I'll hear is that, well, I'm teaching ELA today, I can teach pretty much anything I want because I can make anything fit, these particular curricular outcomes. I've had teachers say that I'm going to have a birthday party today with my students, and which subject are you going to use? Well, ELA, because they're celebrating and building communities somewhere in the curriculum outcomes. You can do anything with ELA. It's become sort of the universal dumping ground of just sort of do whatever you want within this here. What you also don't find emphasized much at all in ELA curriculum guides is some basic things like spelling and grammar. You can find tiny, tiny references to it, but you have to really look for it. And this is why in a lot of classrooms you don't find spelling tests or much actual instruction in grammar, and that's a real problem. When you get to the high school level and you actually hopefully need to be able to write something, or when you go on to university and you find that you're not prepared. This is not, by the way, this is not accidental. It's not like, oops, they forgot to put this in. Maybe by hearing me point this out, maybe they'll put these things more specifically in the curriculum. This is a philosophy here. I'm going to quote from an education professor at York University. Her name is Heather Lotherington. She wrote a letter to the editor in the Globe and Mail where she addressed the issue of spelling and grammar and whether or not students should actually learn their spelling and grammar. And her approach to educational philosophy is pretty widely reflected in education faculties. Here's what she had to say. We educate children for the future they will inherit. Standardized tests of language and literacy test the literacies of a half-century ago, when grammatical knowledge and mastery of spelling and punctuation marked the educated person. Contemporary literacies profoundly invalidate such tests. Literacy now requires mastery over digital tools for collaborative, dynamic, multimodal communication. Continuing to test children's formal spelling using handwriting is a speck on the team-oriented strategizing and programming abilities they will need to succeed. There's some more edubabble for you. Now keep in mind, this letter was written for the general public. Like, this is what they're writing when they're trying to convince the general public of their position. So you can only imagine what those of us who've attended the Faculty of Education here when we're in our classes. Believe me, it's worse than this in terms of what we're taught. But as we could see, what Lotherington is saying here is that don't worry about the spelling and grammar. We got technology stuff we need to think about. We got dynamic, multimodal communication. Don't waste your time doing spelling tests. Of course, that's absurd. Spelling and grammar is just as important now as it ever was. If you don't believe that, ask a business owner who gets a resume, and which resumes go in the recycling bin? The ones with the spelling mistakes. So again, just something to keep in mind about the importance of actually having these things in the curriculum. Now, on this issue of this constructivist approach that I've outlined here, where you kind of remove as much knowledge as you can and make it all about the process, the education professors will argue, and they say this all the time, that research supports their position. Research shows that using these new methods in math, using this process approach in language arts, this is what will help kids actually learn. If you haven't read this book, I recommend it. It's pretty lengthy, it's a little technical, but it has a lot of good information in it. It's called Visible Learning, a synthesis of over 800 meta-analyses relating to achievement. John Hattie is the author. He's a professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Hattie has actually reviewed hundreds, thousands of research studies on the topic of student achievement. And what he does in this book is he actually takes a look at different teaching methods and takes a look at what the research really shows in terms of what helps students learn. And here's what Hattie has to say after reviewing thousands of research studies. He says, the role of the constructivist teacher, that's that romantic progressive philosophy I was telling you about, the role of the constructivist teacher is claimed to be more of facilitation, to provide opportunities for individual students to acquire knowledge and construct meaning through their own activities and through discussion, reflection, and the sharing of ideas with other learners with minimal corrective intervention. These kinds of statements are almost directly opposite to the successful recipe for teaching and learning as will be developed in the following chapters. He says this more than once, that these new approaches, this constructivist philosophy, the philosophy that's dominant in our education faculties, that's not what actually works in terms of instruction in the classroom. And Hattie points this out in his book, how frustrating it is to give speeches around the world and to constantly hear the refrain, direct instruction is bad, constructivism is good, because in his research, he's found the exact opposite. Now, I actually had a very personal experience with this issue of constructivism. I gave a speech at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia earlier this year. And I gave a presentation fairly similar to the one that I'm doing here, where I make my case for having knowledge and content in the curriculum. Now, the education faculty members were there. They had education students there. It was an interesting crowd, I will certainly say. And they had arranged, kindly enough, they had arranged to have two people come up and offer an official rebuttal after my speech. Not one, two they had set up. They had a professor of education in their faculty and a doctoral education student. And they got up, and I'll skip over all the stuff they said about they didn't like, they obviously didn't like my presentation. But there was one thing in particular that really struck me. You know what point they chose to argue the most vigorously with my presentation? They argued with the basic premise that we can identify knowledge that everyone should have. They actually challenged that point. They said there's no such thing as any piece of knowledge that everyone needs to have in common. That was their position. Now, if you sort of think about that for a moment, that there's nothing that anyone needs to have in common, and you think that that actually represents the philosophy of a lot of education professors and how teachers are being trained, and you could see the impact that that would have. Now, when I got back up to offer my response, I asked both of them a pretty straightforward question, at least I thought so. I'd asked them, okay, would you be okay with all schools removing all references to Confederation of 1867 in the history classes? We'll learn a whole bunch of other cool stuff, but we'll just take out all the Confederation stuff, because after all, there's no piece of knowledge everyone needs to have in common. Would you be okay with that? There's about 10 seconds of silence, because they obviously didn't know what to say, because if you say yes, they'd be okay with that, they know that sounds ridiculous. But if they say, no, that wouldn't be fine, they're conceding my point that there's knowledge everyone should have in common. So what ended up happening? Well, fortunately, the Dean of Education spoke up and said, well, no, of course that wouldn't be okay. Yes, everyone should know about Confederation. So she ended up breaking the silence and supporting my position, at least in terms of that everyone should have knowledge in common. But I'll tell you, it's a different thought world when one of the main things you have to argue with people is that there's actually knowledge everyone should have. It's a really different way of thinking when that's your main point that you have to battle. So certainly this anti-knowledge approach, major issue. What are some of the other issues that in public education today? Well, one thing we see is what I call an anti-testing bias. Most of the animosity against testing tends to be against standardized exams. Teachers' unions in particular really don't like standardized exams, but education faculties generally don't like them either. There is this shift away from measuring what students actually know to these process-based assessments. Instead of having one test that everyone should write with specific things everyone should know, the advocates of this approach say, you know what, no, we don't want to have so much testing. We'd rather have the teacher just construct their own stuff and then you can just adjust it for students as necessary. And of course, nothing standardized there, and they don't even like unit tests a whole lot. And so, of course, as I said, teachers' unions in particular fervently oppose standardized testing. Manitoba, the province that I'm from, the teachers' union has been very influential on this. In 1999, when there was a previous government in power, we actually had standardized testing at the grades 3, 6, 9, and 12 level. It was actually a pretty advanced system, similar to what Alberta has now. Systematically, those tests were removed, starting with the grade 3 level, and then the 6 and 9 exams were made optional, and then now the grade 12 exams are still there, but they're not even being marked centrally, so they're not even really fully standardized anymore. And what's interesting is that Manitoba simultaneously has gone from the middle of the pack in terms of our international assessments and the pan-Canadian indicators down to second last. Now, I know correlation doesn't prove causation, but that's very interesting that over the exact time period, our province has just plummeted in terms of our national and international standing. Now, one of the arguments that's often made against the standardized testing in particular, the types that the province, where the province will create the test and then administer it to all students, one of the arguments that's often made is that it's really expensive. We need to cut standardized testing to save money. The Elementary Federation Teachers Union in Ontario proposed a moratorium on the assessments that they're called there in order to save money. Now, I just want to show you here what the total budget of what's called the EQAO, the Education Quality and Accountability Office, their total budget compared with Ontario's total budget in terms of education, and then you sort of make your own conclusion about how much money this approach would actually save. Okay, so here's the province of Ontario. Size of Ontario's education budget in 2011, $23.2 billion. Entire budget of the EQAO in Ontario. That's all the standardized testing, all the staff, all the support, all the marking, everything. Total budget, $33 million. Percentage of Ontario's education budget taken up by standardized testing, 0.14%. So you're going to actually argue that the best way to save money is to cut 0.14% of the budget and remove the ability for the province to identify which schools are doing well and which schools are doing poorly. It makes about as much sense as removing diagnostic equipment from hospitals as a healthcare cost-saving mechanism. It just doesn't make any sense. So there's an anti-testing bias out there in a lot of provinces. There's been a shift away from testing, and I think that's a major problem. Another issue that's a problem in our schools today, what I call useless fads and edubabble. I'm just going to read a list of some phrases that teachers tend to hear a lot. Authentic assessment, learning to learn, student-centered classrooms, whole language for teaching reading, open area classrooms. These are just some examples of fads that either have been in our schools or are currently being implemented in our schools today. And you know what all these fads do? Without getting into all the details of all of them, I'm going to talk about one of them in a second, but you know what they do? They certainly lead to one universal, and that's the growth of the number of consultants that a school division needs to hire. The bigger the school division, the more consultants they hire. And what's the job of an educational consultant? Well, to go bug classroom teachers, because you have to justify your job. So you have to put on sessions and training, and you have to bring in speakers, and then, of course, to justify your job, you need to get teachers to report to you about are they implementing what they're supposed to. And you have all these consultants, and their job is to essentially make sure that all these fads are being implemented. Similarly, one universal among teachers, and not every single teacher will say this, but an awful lot will say that, boy, those teacher in-services, what a waste of time. Teacher training courses at university, what a waste of time. I don't know of any other profession where so many people who've been trained in that profession will make that type of statement. I don't know of too many dentists who say, boy, that dental school, what a waste of time. I could do dentistry better than before I went in. No, they tend to agree the dental school was actually good, but an awful lot of teachers will say that, boy, that teacher training, not such a good use of time. So what's one particular fad that's really common in schools today that I want to pick on? Well, many of you might be familiar with this gentleman. His name is Lyndon Dorval. He's technically he still is a teacher in Edmonton at Ross Shepherd High School. He teaches high school physics. He was suspended in May of this year. And he was suspended for doing something absolutely terrible. And what was this terrible thing that Mr. Dorval did? Well, apparently, there were some students in his physics classes that didn't hand in their assignments. Even though they were reminded to do so repeatedly, they still didn't get their assignments in. And he gave them a 0. And his school has a no-zero policy. It's actually right in their assessment policy. Teachers cannot give 0s for missing work, for incomplete work. They can't do it. And so he refused to comply. He kept on giving 0s. His principal recommended to the superintendent that he should be suspended from the classroom. And so he was. But of course, he didn't go quietly into the night. I'm sure most of us have heard some of the basics of this story. Well, I can say that based on what I've seen about this, there's been overwhelming support of Mr. Dorval. This cuts across all party lines, all demographics. People don't like no-zero policies. I don't normally cite newspaper online those surveys that they do because I know they're not scientific, but sometimes they'll give just a little bit of an indicator as to where the public is at. Well, the Edmonton Journal had a survey question about, do you support no-zero policies? And they usually get about 300 or 400 respondents per day. This one, they got 12,000 responses. They've never had so many responses. The final tally, 97% said no to no-zero policies. It literally is the entire general public versus a very insular educational group there. It really cuts across all lines there. And yet, so far at Edmonton, the superintendent, the principal, even the teachers' union have actually closed ranks and have generally been supportive of the no-zero policy. Now, this is not something in effect just in Alberta in this one school. There's a number of Saskatchewan school divisions that have no-zero policies in place. The Saskatoon Public School Board, the Prairie Spirit School Division, both of those prohibit teachers from deducting marks for late work, giving zeros for incomplete work, or even deducting marks, get this, for plagiarism or cheating on tests. The consequence for plagiarism is that you're supposed to do the assignment again properly. Now that's the consequence now, for plagiarism. Same thing for cheating on tests. Can you imagine if the consequence for a lawyer who encouraged her client to lie on the stand was, you know what, okay, you've suborned perjury, that's really bad, you've got to do the questioning again on the stand until you get this right. Again, this is something that is right here in Saskatchewan. Now, about a little over a year ago, the former education minister vowed to get to the bottom of this. This was well reported in the CBC and other media outlets. She vowed to get to the bottom of it. She said she was going to reverse this policy. And then, I was just amazed at this response. A few months later, she actually made the statement that actually she doesn't have any authority to force the school divisions to reverse their no-zero policy because the school boards have jurisdiction over assessment and not the Minister of Education. Now, just a sort of a basic lesson in terms of different levels of government and how these things work. School boards are created by the provincial government. The provincial government can amalgamate school boards, abolish school boards, create new school boards, and you better believe they can tell school boards what they're supposed to do. Provinces do this all the time when they give orders to school boards. I don't know what else to say other than, I guess, the edubabblers in the department or whatever got to her, because ultimately the decision was made, we're not going to do anything. And so now we have at least 2 school divisions, and possibly more, these are just the 2 that got media coverage, that still have this policy in place, still say you can't give zeros, still say you can't deduct marks for late work. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Now, supporters of no-zero policies will argue that the research is on their side. They say there's all this evidence supporting the no-zero approach. Now, as much as I'd like to get into the specifics on this, I'm not going to right now, but there's a very specific reason why. Stay tuned for Monday, August 27th. My research report called Zero Support for No-Zero Policies will be officially released by the Frontier Centre. And basically what I do in this report is I take a look at what are the actual arguments used for the no-zero policies, what are the actual research studies cited by proponents of this policy, and, well, I think the title says it all in terms of what I find. But as much as I'd like to get into all the stuff in the report and hand it out right now, I don't want to preempt myself. This is scheduled to come out on Monday, so stay tuned. You'll be able to access this report for free on the Frontier website, on my personal website, and I'm pretty sure it'll get some media coverage as well. This is an issue that's attracted a lot of attention. So stay tuned for my rebuttal to this particular edubabble policy. And then a final major problem that we see in our schools today is what I say is a lack of responsiveness to parents. The reality is this: there is a huge demand among parents for traditional methods of education. And if you don't believe that, take a look at the number of parents who are shelling out their own money for Sylvan Learning Center tutoring, or Kumon Math and Science, or Oxford Learning. All these different tutoring agencies are doing really well. They're in growth mode. Why are these tutoring agencies flourishing if parents were satisfied with what's happening in public education? I know people in this province, in Manitoba and elsewhere, that are very frustrated. It doesn't matter if their kids are going to an inner city school or a school in the richest area of a city. They're shelling out this extra money for this tutoring, not to get their kids ahead, not to move them ahead of grade level, just to make sure they can actually do math. And guess what teaching methods tend to be used in these private tutoring centers? You guessed it, traditional instruction, direct teaching approaches, memorize these things, because those things actually work. You don't think most parents are going to actually shell out their own money for teaching methods that don't work. That's why you don't have programs called hooked on whole language. I've heard of hooked on phonics, but I don't think hooked on whole language is going to sell to any parent because it just doesn't work. And of course, the problem is that parents want to see change, but they're stymied by the edublob bureaucracy, where the schools will say, yes, we'd love to have your input, and then they will put you on this focus group or on this parent council, which really their main job is to just fundraise for the school or whatever it happens to be, and they actually aren't able to get the changes they want to see in the public school system. And so it's very frustrating for parents, and it's evidenced by the amount of money that they're having to spend on their kids' education in terms of their tutoring. So how do we address some of these problems? How do we go about fixing our schools? Well, there's a key point I want to make and then a few specifics right after it. The key point is this: we need to change our focus. And it's actually very simple when you think about it. We need more accountability in regards to student achievement, but we need more autonomy in regards to how schools get there. So what does that mean? Well, accountability in regards to student achievement. We need to actually focus on results. Have kids actually learned? And yes, that means some testing. And yes, standardized testing. Not the only thing, but it does mean that. But it also means less micromanaging at the school level. Most public schools have this exactly reversed, where you don't have much accountability on student achievement because you don't have a lot of tests, and even if you do, sometimes the data's not even released, so it's all kind of fuzzy. But they make up for it by micromanaging everything that you're doing. They make up for it by sending in the assessment consultant and the math consultant and the ELA consultant to come tell you what to do in your classroom. And so you have frustrated teachers that don't have autonomy in their classroom, and they would like to be able to say, look, my methods are working, but they're not able to prove it because the student achievement is not what's being focused on. So we need to change our focus and focus on accountability and achievement, but autonomy in terms of how we get there. How do we do that? Well, a couple of things. First of all, we obviously need to raise academic standards. Now, I know that some people, when they hear that, they go, okay, here's the traditional back to basics, add more to the curriculum, make kids work more, et cetera, et cetera. No, actually, that's not exactly what I mean. I'm not actually talking about giving teachers more work. I'm definitely not talking about making the curriculum guides longer. They're plenty long as they are. Rather, I'm talking about a change in focus. And there's a great book out there that I'm going to plug. It's called Focus: Elevating the Essentials to Radically Improve Student Learning by Mike Schmoker. Schmoker is a former teacher and school administrator who has identified, I think very effectively, how we can actually improve academic standards without having to make it a whole lot harder for teachers to administer. And he points out that schools should do three things. If you do these three things, your standards will go up. We need a reasonably coherent curriculum. This goes into having some specifics within the curriculum. Second, we need sound lessons. And third, we need purposeful reading and writing in every discipline. So a reasonably coherent curriculum, sound lessons, and purposeful reading and writing in every discipline. If you do those three things, you will have very effective schools in terms of your academic standards. And he says that if you're not doing each of these three things, you're not doing it well, don't add new initiatives. Don't add the Healthy Living Initiative and the Sustainability Initiative and the Save the Planet Initiative and all these other things that all of a sudden have suddenly become the responsibility of the schools. Do these things first. Actually focus on your academics and make sure that you're actually learning these things. He also says something very interesting about this importance of content, this coherent curriculum. He says critical thinking is in fact highly dependent on content knowledge. We can't understand, much less critically evaluate the ideas in a textbook, newspaper, or magazine if they contain too much unfamiliar information. If we don't know enough about the subject we're reading about, we may bog down and become confused as we read. That's very true. Kids are able to read at a really high reading level if they know something about the book they're reading. You take a kid who knows baseball, he can read an article about baseball that's written at a really high grade level. Why? Because he knows about baseball. Similarly, if you want adults, grade 12 graduates, to be able to read a newspaper and understand it, they'd better know a little bit about this country. they better know a bit about our history. They'd better know a bit about how government works. Because if they don't, if you have to go to Wikipedia every time to try to figure out what parliamentary democracy is, you're not going to do a whole lot of critical thinking about anything having to do with our government. You have to have some stuff in your brain memorized, and that's where the specific content comes into place. So how do we actually put this into place? Well, Schmoker says, let's revamp ELA. Dump these thick curriculum guides. Like, you could virtually get rid of them. Like, there's so much nebulous stuff in there. Replace it with a list of specific books and articles that every kid should actually have to read. Now, that shouldn't be everything they have to do. Of course, teachers should still have some discretion, but have some things mentioned. Have maybe half of what they're supposed to do mentioned. What's wrong with that? With identifying some classics, some things that everyone should actually be familiar with. It shouldn't actually be that hard to come up with a list of what everyone should be familiar with. And identify at the high school level how many essays they should have to write and how long they should be. You know, at the grade 11 level, you should have to write 5 essays of 5 pages each or whatever. And put that in the curriculum. Take out all the edubabble and put some of those things in. And he says you'd be light years ahead. Now, I know the government's not about to just change the curriculum right away. Can we put some of Schmoker's advice into effect even without changing the curriculum? Well, we could. And here's where we see the flip side of the issue. Because before I said one of the problems with the curriculum is it's so nebulous and broad you could do just about anything within it. Well, the positive thing in that is that it's so nebulous and broad you could do all this without having to actually change the curriculum. So you can put specific things in there. You can actually, school could require specific books, and you could actually have these things specified, and you'd still be following the curriculum. Now, I think the better approach is to actually have the curriculum mention some of this, but got to work with what we have. I would say also, in terms of this academic standards issue, use traditional teaching methods. Don't use them exclusively, but don't downplay them all the time. Like every in-service teachers go to, it's always about don't stand in front of your class and lecture, don't put the desks in rows facing the front, don't this and this, make sure they're in groups and it's dynamic and blah, 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 blah. You know, you're basically made to feel that traditional teaching methods don't work. Well, think about this for a moment. The most prominent advocate of these progressive teaching methods is a guy by the name of Hattie. He's written many books. He is the ultimate progressive educator. In his book, The Schools Our Children Deserve, he actually has a chart at the back. And in the chart at the back, he actually has a list of things that you should be worried about if it's in your kid's classroom. He said you should be worried if the desks are in rows facing the front. You should be worried if the teacher is standing in front of the room. You should be worried if the teacher seems to be doing most of the talking. And on he goes. Now, Hattie gives an awful lot of speeches every year. He talks to a lot of teachers' groups. And he goes, and it's interesting because he stands in front of an audience, usually on a podium, and how are the desks set up? Usually the desks are in rows, kind of like this, facing the front. Now, if Hattie really believed that a lecture is a terrible way of teaching, well, he should follow his own advice. He should get in front of the teachers. He should say, you know what, class? I don't have anything to say to you. Rather, I want you guys to construct your own ideas of what good teaching is. Now, I want you to get into groups. I'm going to hand out chart paper and some markers, and I want you to talk about what you think good teaching is. Is Hattie going to do that? Well, of course he's not going to do that because he wants to get his ideas across. And he knows that the most effective and efficient way to communicate important concepts to his students is a lecture that he himself has composed and organized. So the most prominent advocate of progressive teaching methods, when it's down to a crunch and he wants to make sure people understand his ideas, he becomes a big advocate of direct instruction because he wants to get his ideas across. What's another thing that I think would improve our schools? Well, we need regular testing. You know, it's just absolutely essential. But we don't need just one type of testing. There's actually a couple of different types. First of all, there's teacher-created tests. You know, this is where the teacher makes up the test based on the understanding of the students and, his or her knowledge of the curriculum. There's a lot of pros to a teacher-created test, and the key one is that teachers can take individual student needs into account when designing tests. That's a good thing. I mean, that's why teachers should be designing tests. There is a weakness, though. There's a downside to having a teacher create all the tests. The test standards vary from teacher to teacher. So you will get, one teacher creates one type of test, another teacher creates another type of test, and you could have the same curriculum, even the same school, and it's totally different what the students are getting. So how do we address that? Well, we go to the other side. We have what are called standardized tests, and these are the tests that are created centrally by the provincial government that are correlated to the provincial curriculum. The key strength of a standardized test is that you evaluate all students by the same set of standards. That's a pretty powerful strength. And this way you identify specific skills everyone should have, a reading level that everyone should have, specific math skills, and you give everyone the same test at the same time, and you actually find out what schools need more assistance, what schools are doing well. Seems pretty common sense to me. Now, are standardized tests all you should do? Of course not. There's a pretty obvious weakness with standardized testing. Not everything that's important, not all important concepts can be evaluated this way. There's lots of skills that you can't evaluate by a standardized test. You can't evaluate someone's character or even certain types of knowledge terribly well with a standardized test. So it shouldn't be the only type of testing you should do. But you also shouldn't never do it. You need to have a balanced approach where you have both teacher-created tests and standardized tests. They're important components of student assessment. So why not do both? But I find it remarkable that the teachers' unions in particular are just fervently opposed to standardized tests. And I do know, by the way, that the Saskatchewan government, there's some information on their website where they've been talking about, and it's a little fuzzy, but I'm hoping they get clear, where they're talking about replacing some of the tests they have now, which are only done every couple of years, with tests that are done on a more regular basis. I'm hoping they're talking about actual standardized tests that are consistent from grade to grade, but it's a little fuzzy at this point. But it's just absolutely essential. But no one says you should do only standardized testing. You have this combined with the teacher-created tests. This is not, one of the arguments teachers' unions make is they'll say, oh, this takes away the professionalism of teachers. Not at all. Other professionals use standardized instruments all the time. Would you want to go see an optometrist who said, I don't believe in standardized assessments. I make my own eye chart. I don't believe in using this equipment that's given to me here because I want to use my own creativity because I know my patients. I don't think you'd stay with that optometrist terribly long. You have a balanced approach where the optometrist uses a combination of a standardized chart, standardized instruments, standardized procedures, and professional judgment. And you put all that together and you get a pretty good idea about how the person's eyes are doing. And it doesn't take away from his or her professionalism to use some standardized instruments. Now, I'm going to preempt an argument that's often made against standardized testing. I'll try to do this just briefly, but it's what I call the Finland argument, because it's the standard, for a bit of a pun there, I guess, it's the standard argument made against standardized testing. Finland is a country that has very good achievement in terms of international assessments, the Program for International Student Assessment. They have a lot of things in their school system that are quite impressive. I like a lot of things about the Finland system. One of the things, however, that's pointed out is that Finland doesn't do standardized testing, and look how well they're doing around the world. They're #1. So how can you advocate standardized testing when, Finland they're not doing standardized testing and they're doing just great? And then, of course, you add on to that a little bit, just to make the argument a little bit more punch. Which country does all the standardized testing? Oh, big bad United States. And look how bad they're doing. So we don't want standardized testing because look how bad the U.S. is, look how good Finland is. Now, on the surface, some people might think, oh, that's a pretty good argument. But let's sort of think through this logically here. First of all, the question that I want to ask is this. How do we know that Finland has a really good education system? How do we know? Oh, it's a standardized test, the Program for International Student Assessment. And you know what the irony is? It's an international standardized test. It's not even correlated to the curriculum. It's actually the broadest brushstroke standardized test you can get, focusing on some pretty narrow skills, and yet people are willing to say, hey, they've got the best education system in the world. Well, if standardized testing is so bad and doesn't really tell you anything, then why are you using it to say that Finland's got this great system? It's sort of this catch-22 that you can't really say that standardized testing is useless when you're using standardized testing to point out how great Finland is. Second thing in response, Finland does have standardized testing. Now, they don't have it at most of the grade levels, but they do have it at a very important grade level, grade 12. And we're not talking about just a little test at the end of grade 12. It's a massive content-focused test. There's a very interesting book about the Finnish system. It's by Pasi Sahlberg. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It's called Finnish Lessons, very good book. And he doesn't like standardized testing. It kind of shows in the book. But he acknowledges that, yeah, that grade 12 standardized test, it's pretty pumped. It's very pumped in Finland. It does affect their curriculum. It does affect teaching. So yes, it does have an impact on what's happening in schools. So they do have standardized testing. It's a high-stakes standardized exam, all the more. Thirdly, there's other things about Finland that we might want to keep in mind, both in terms of their cultural dynamics. Finland is a very homogeneous country, 90 to 95% of one cultural language group, a little different than the Canadian and American systems for that matter. Now, that doesn't make their system irrelevant to compare to ours, but it does mean that there's a lot of factors that you want to consider before just making a universal, just do everything that Finland is doing. Plus, there's a whole series of other things that Finland does that I think need to be factored in as well, and that's in terms of the amount of education teachers need to have. They have content-focused curricula. Actually, they do a lot of the content things in the curriculum that I've been talking about here. They actually do have some of these things specified. So it's very, very simplistic to say that Finland doesn't do standardized testing, so we shouldn't either. It's really a lot more complex than that. Third thing I think that's important, that I think we need more of in this country, we need school choice. And I'm not talking about just simply opening it up and seeing like just whatever happens. We actually have an example of how school choice can work in this country in the neighboring province, in the city of Edmonton. For the last 30 years or so, Edmonton has had a philosophy of education that's focused on choice, where they actually allow parents to choose whatever school they want their kids to go to. As long as there's room in the school, they can actually have their kids go to that school. They don't have to go to the neighborhood school. They can go to the neighborhood school, but they don't have to. And then there's lots of flexibility within the school itself, and so you have different types of schools within that. You have sports-oriented schools, you have arts schools, you have Christian schools, you even have Islamic schools, all within the public system. The basic premise is this: money follows the student. So if the money goes to one school, and then if you go to a different school, the money instead goes to that school, and the principal has control over that. And so if you just consider, if you move away from this divisive debate about scary words like vouchers and all that sort of thing, and just simply talk about, do you agree with the premise that parents should be able to spend the money the way that they see fit in terms of their schooling? Should they be able to say that my kid's going to this school, I want the money to follow my kid to this school as long as the curriculum is being followed and proper teaching methods are being used? Well, why not? Why not let parents use the funds that are allocated to their student and have some discretion? Now, you combine this with empowering principals, and this is something that Edmonton does fairly well also. One thing that research does show is that principals set the tone for their school and let them make key decisions. Don't just make principals middle managers where they're kind of managing a process system. Don't just have them in a system where they're just following directions from the assistant to the assistant superintendent who's following advice from the consultant, and they're being told that, on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, this particular consultant's going to come here between 11 and noon. Make sure all your teachers are ready to hear the consultant. What's the point of being a principal if you don't actually have any control over anything? Rather, give them some autonomy. Let them actually control the budget for their school. In Edmonton, the principals control about 90% of all the budget, for their school is actually controlled by the principal. Now, there's parameters they have to work within, but they actually have some discretion. But here's the thing. They're accountable because in Edmonton, and frankly throughout Alberta, standardized tests are quite common, and the data is made available to the public. So guess what? You need to be able to show that your students are actually learning. If you can show your students are learning, well, there's a pretty good chance that more people are going to want to attend your school and you're going to be more successful. If students aren't learning, well, then maybe you should start changing some things in your school and doing things a bit better. But if you can prove that students are learning the curriculum, who cares whether your school day starts at 8:30 or 9 o'clock? It's amazing how some communities, they get into arguments of what time do you start school. I mean, if the kids are learning, let the principal, in consultation with the parents, decide and let them actually do things that actually work. So have some choice and some flexibility and empower the principals at the same time, and you can have some pretty impressive results. So I want to say in conclusion a couple of things. Not everything that is trendy is the right thing to do. There is education, there's a lot of trends and fads in education. One of the best ways to think of it is that there's a pendulum. It swings back and forth depending on what decade you have to be in. I don't know of any other profession that will say, got to do this. This is the thing you got to do. And then a few years later, oh, that was totally wrong. We got to do this now. This is the best thing now. And then, oh, no, that was totally wrong. Now we're going to rename this and do this again. I mean, this happens in education where it goes back and forth. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, wait a second, does this actually make sense? We shouldn't be afraid to do the right thing even when we are in the minority. Just because most people in the upper echelons in education faculties all think the same way, that doesn't necessarily mean that their approach is correct. In fact, I'm arguing very much that their approach is not correct. We need to have a candid discussion about what's going on in schools. It's not sufficient to assume that everything is going just fine. Best gift we can give our students is for them to receive the best education possible, every high school graduate should have the fundamental skills and knowledge necessary to be successful in our modern society. And that's the goal that I think we have to work towards. So I want to thank everyone for their attention. I think there'll be some question and answer, but thank you very much for taking time to hear what I had to say today.